The guard didn't even flinch. Not when the barbed wire rattled. Not when the sun scorched the red Texas dirt. Not even when the little girl handed her dripping bowl of vanilla ice cream through the fence, past the enemy combatant sign, to a man with a swastika on his sleeve. The German didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just stared at the melting swirl in his hands like it was a relic from a world he'd been told didn't exist. A world with kindness. Behind him, 25 other POWs froze. None of them reached forward. None of them made a sound. Except one, a boy, barely 19, whose name the guards couldn't pronounce. He let out something like a sob or a laugh, and then, quietly, he took a bite. It was the first ice cream he had tasted in his life. And it came not from Berlin or Munich or even the Reich's rations, but from a 5-year-old girl in a sun hat who had no idea what a Nazi was. That day, Sergeant Calvin Hart wrote in his journal, "The fence didn't fall, but something did. One man dropped his spoon, another dropped his shoulders. I think the war ended a little, right there." No orders were given, no speeches were made, just a moment, a bowl. A silence so thick even the cicadas hushed. And yet, no one could explain why the guards cried that day. Maybe it wasn't about the ice cream, maybe it was about what the prisoners didn't say, or maybe, just maybe, something even stranger came next. The first thing they noticed was the light. Not the rifles, not the fences, not even the guard towers. It was the fact that at 10:43 p.m., well past lights out at any German barracks, the American base still glowed like a city fairground. Barn-sized lamps lit the football field. The mess hall still buzzed. Even the latrines had electric bulbs humming overhead like lazy bees. And across the fence in the town beyond, they could see a neon sign blinking red over a diner. Open 24 hours. For Private Dieter Weiss, that glow was more than just light. It was contradiction. "Back home," he whispered to the man bunking beside him, "we melted snow for water after Dresden. My sister lined blackout curtains every night with tape, and here, they just leave it on." That first night, none of the POWs slept. Not because they feared attack, but because they couldn't stop staring at the bulbs. Small, steady suns defying every ration. Every blackout drill, every night of propaganda that told them America was a nation in decay. One guard, noticing their fixation, flicked a switch off as a joke. The sudden darkness made them flinch. When he turned it back on, a few of them laughed. One clapped. It was the first laugh they'd shared since capture. But beneath it, a silence. The kind of silence that says, "We were lied to." The next morning, Klaus scribbled again in his notebook. "We used to say, they can't even keep their lights on. Turns out, they never turn them off." And that was nothing compared to what they saw next. They expected prison food, moldy crusts, watery soup, maybe dry oats if the guards were feeling generous. What landed on their trays didn't make sense. Soft, white sandwich bread, the kind so fluffy it deflated at a touch. Slices of ham. Real butter, potatoes roasted golden, not boiled grey. And then, the bottle, Coca-Cola. Private Ernst Holler didn't dare open it at first. He'd seen the posters. Decadent America, gluttonous capitalism, sugar-rotted teeth. He thought maybe it was a test, or poison, or both. But across from him, a Texan guard in mirrored sunglasses cracked open his own, took a long drink, let out a satisfied sigh that echoed through the mess hall like a sermon. So Ernst opened his too. The fizz bit his nose. The cold burned his throat. And for a second, just a second, he wasn't a soldier. He was a boy again, chasing fireflies in the Bavarian woods before the sirens came. I thought heaven was quiet, he would write later, but it turns out it sounds like carbonation. Some of the older POWs scoffed. One called it soft war. Another muttered, "This is how they rot your soul, through the stomach." But their plates were clean. The real twist came not from the taste, but from the trash. That night, Ernst watched through a slat in the barracks wall as the Americans tossed away entire loaves of bread, untouched, still in plastic. One guard even threw out a full crate of Coke, said it had gotten too warm. Ernst didn't sleep. He just stared at his empty bottle like it had betrayed him. Or worse, like it had awakened him. The war had already taken his brother, his town, his faith in victory. But now, it was taking something deeper. His certainty. We were told Americans were starving. They are, but only for truth. And yet, this was only lunch. Something even stranger came next. They thought it was a rumor, an exaggeration from some overfed Texan guard trying to impress them. One plane, every hour, like clockwork. That's what he said, leaning against the fence, chewing tobacco as if he were describing a vending machine. But it wasn't every hour. It was faster. In April 1944, 10 German POWs were loaded onto a military bus and taken, blindfolded, across 2 counties. They expected punishment, maybe interrogation. What they got was something worse, something harder to explain to a man raised on steel rations and slow assembly lines. They got Detroit. At the edge of the massive Ford Willow Run plant, the guards removed the blindfolds. What the prisoners saw wasn't a factory. It was a living organism. Steel went in one end, bombers came out the other. B-24 Liberators, monstrous 4-engine beasts, rolled off the line every 63 minutes. And every bolt, every gauge, every inch of fuselage had been touched not by soldiers, but by women, housewives, librarians, waitresses. Rosie the Riveter was not a symbol, she was everywhere. One POW dropped his notebook, another simply sat down. In Germany, factories were sacred. Here they are symphonies, wrote Corporal Helmuth Klein. Each woman with a wrench is a conductor. They saw conveyor belts longer than football fields, lunchrooms bigger than their entire village squares, babies in bassinets next to blueprints. Efficiency had become a religion, and every worker a quiet priest. But the final twist? The Americans didn't hide it. No camouflage nets, no armed patrols inside the plant, because they didn't need to. They had production, scale, and absurd confidence. As the prisoners were escorted back to the bus, one guard tossed a folded leaflet into Helmuth's lap. It was in German. It read, "We don't need you to lose. You just need to look." He did, and for the first time, he didn't blink. But that was just industry. What came next smelled like childhood. It wasn't the guards, it wasn't the officers, it was the children. A pickup truck rolled up outside the compound one Sunday afternoon. The kind of dusty Ford flatbed you'd expect to carry hay or oil drums. But this time, it carried something else entirely. A cooler, a wooden box, and about 6 kids bouncing in the back like popcorn. They weren't soldiers. They weren't afraid. The oldest girl, maybe 12, marched right up to the gate, hair braided tight, freckles across her nose like constellations. "Mama said they'd like some," she said, holding up a dripping scoop of vanilla on a tin cone. The guard looked confused. The lieutenant looked furious, but neither stopped her. Inside the fence, 50 German POWs stood frozen. Half of them instinctively stepped back. The other half leaned forward like moths, drawn to something warm and impossible. The ice cream was real, cold, sweet, sticky. It smelled like birthdays. Private Karl Metzger had marched through Paris, fought in Stalingrad, watched comrades die in snow and fire. But when that little boy, couldn't have been older than 7, handed him a chocolate scoop through the fence and smiled. Karl didn't reach for it. He wept. "We were not taught how to accept kindness from our enemies," he wrote years later. "Especially not the kind that melts in your hand." The guards didn't know what to do. One turned his back. Another offered a spoon. And somewhere, someone laughed, not out of joy, but out of disbelief. The ice cream melted faster than they could eat it. And still, the kids stood there asking questions no soldier could answer. Did you all have cows in Germany? Do you know Mickey Mouse? Is it true you all never had bubble gum? That night, there was no roll call, no drills, just silence, and the smell of milk, cocoa, and something neither side could name. Whatever melted that day wasn't just dairy, and still something even stranger was coming. They were prisoners, but that door didn't lock. The library was just a converted barracks shed, 100 square feet of worn shelves, creaking floorboards, and the faint smell of paper and pine. But to the German POWs, it was a breach in the wall, a loophole in the logic of war. The sign outside read, POW Education Program, Voluntary. Private Wilhelm Krauss stood at the threshold for a long time. Books had been tools of the regime in Germany, assigned, censored, feared. He remembered book burnings in Leipzig. He remembered a teacher who vanished for assigning Hemingway. Now here, Hemingway sat on a shelf next to Dickens, Twain, and something called the Saturday Evening Post. No one told him what to read. No one checked what he chose. He picked the grapes of wrath because it sounded angry. By chapter 3, he wasn't angry anymore. He was quiet. They wrote about American suffering, Wilhelm whispered to another POW, but not blaming, just surviving. Within weeks, English classes sprang up, taught by volunteers. Some guards even brought old textbooks from home. One chaplain handed out dictionaries like they were Bibles. But what truly shattered them wasn't what they read. It was what they saw in the margins, pencil notes, underlines, questions like, why does Tom Joad stay? Is justice the same as revenge? These weren't military propaganda. These were thoughts, uncontrolled, unpunished. And for the first time, many POWs realized Americans aren't afraid of questions. Wilhelm didn't finish the book. He copied the last paragraph into his notebook instead. I'll be everywhere, wherever you look. Wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. He underlined the last 3 words. I'll be there. What they didn't know yet was that some of them would stay. The man next to him had dysentery. Bad. He was burning with fever, barely conscious, curled in a fetal position on the concrete floor of the infirmary. Private Franz Becker, trained in first aid during the Blitzkrieg, had seen worse. But what shocked him wasn't the sickness. It was the treatment. An American medic, sleeves rolled, hair slicked, no rifle in sight, leaned over the German prisoner with a practiced calm. He gave orders in English the POWs couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, careful, kind. Then came the needle. Penicillin. That was the twist. That was the part Franz couldn't stop replaying in his head. He used it on a prisoner. Franz whispered later, on one of us. Do you understand? Back in Europe, his own brother had died after being told there wasn't enough medicine to go around. Only officers, only frontline combatants got penicillin. Here, in a prisoner camp in Texas, the enemy got it before the war hero ever did. When the fever broke, the medic didn't even celebrate. He just moved on to the next cot. Franz watched, paralyzed by a thought that felt too dangerous to finish. What if they don't hate us? Some POWs scoffed. It's just a strategy, they muttered, to turn us soft. But when another prisoner with a toothache was offered Novocaine, he wept from the numbness. Not because it hurt, because it didn't. The hardest part wasn't the medicine. It was the realization that someone had decided their suffering wasn't necessary. Franz stared at his own hands that night. The same hands that had tossed grenades into Russian trenches now trembled over a cup of clean water and aspirin. This wasn't mercy. This was a mirror. But the deepest fracture in their faith was still coming. It was just a newspaper, left behind on a bench in the yard. Maybe by accident, maybe not. The headline read, Allied Troops Liberate Buchenwald. Below it, a grainy black and white photo. Too blurry to see clearly, yet sharp enough to wound. Rows of skeletons with eyes, cages, children, corpses stacked like firewood. Private Otto Lenz picked it up out of habit. He'd always been the reader of the group, the one who copied Churchill's speeches just to see how the enemy spoke. But this he didn't copy. He folded the paper once, twice, then opened it again, as if the image would change. Another POW leaned over his shoulder, said nothing, just placed a hand on Otto's back, and that was worse than words. They told us the Allies invented stories, Otto wrote. But this wasn't a story. This was a face. Later that night, he asked a guard, "Is this real?" The guard didn't answer. He just nodded. Once, slowly. It wasn't just the photo, it was the date. The issue was already 2 weeks old. No one had locked it up. No one had hidden it. As if they weren't afraid of the truth. Back home, the truth was always escorted by fear. Otto told the chaplain, "Here, it walks alone." A few POWs insisted it was propaganda. Others blamed the victims or the weather or the war. But something had shifted. Not in belief, in posture. Men stopped sitting in rows, stopped singing marching songs. Some even stopped speaking German out loud. Otto didn't burn the paper. He kept it, folded in 4, inside his pillowcase, because whatever came next would be seen through different eyes. They called it the whisper of death, because you never heard it coming. Not the whine of the shell, not the crack of the barrel, just a soft pop, and then a fireball above your head. Proximity fuses, explosives that didn't need to hit you to kill you. They only needed to know you were nearby. The first time Sergeant Eric Voss heard about them, he laughed. American fantasy, he told his bunkmate. You cannot teach a bullet to think. But then came the footage. A projector wheeled into the camp auditorium. No guards. Just a chaplain. He said, "This is from our Navy. You don't have to watch." But every seat was filled. The reel rolled. Fuzzy black and white clips. Japanese planes diving. American destroyers launching a curtain of fire into the sky. And then, mid-air, the shells burst. Not on impact, not by timer, but when they got close. 1-0 exploded mid-turn. Another was shredded before it could even release its payload. The Germans in the audience didn't breathe. It was like watching a machine that could feel fear, Erich later wrote. Like the sky itself had betrayed us. The chaplain said nothing, he simply changed the reel. This time it was the Ardennes. Their own front, their own troops, shelled before they could fire. Hit not on sight, but on approach. Erich stood up, walked out, vomited behind the mess hall. He would later stare at the gravel beneath his boots and whisper to no one, "If they can make a fuse, think, why do they still bother talking to us?" That night, a guard found him staring at the moon. He asked, "You all right, Sarge?" Erich replied, "How do you fight someone who teaches metal to make decisions?" There was no answer, just the low hum of Texas cicadas, and somewhere in the dark, a spark. Because the most dangerous thing wasn't the fuse, it was what came after. It started with a hymn. Sunday morning, hot already by 8 a.m., the kind of Texas heat that clings to your shirt like guilt. The POWs were doing yard work, raking gravel, repainting fence posts, when the music drifted over from the chapel. Voices, harmonies, English words sung slowly, solemnly. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Private Lucas Meyer froze. The rake slid from his hands. Back in Bavaria, his mother had sung that tune. Not in English, but the melody, the rise and fall of it, was unmistakable. He hadn't heard it since the winter of '41, the last winter she was alive. That song did not belong to America, he wrote later. It belonged to the dead. The guards didn't stop him. No one told him to keep working. So he walked, slowly, cautiously, toward the chain-link fence nearest the chapel. A few others followed. By the second verse, more than a dozen POWs stood in silence, listening. And then, something unthinkable. A chaplain opened the back door of the chapel, waved them in. There was a moment, a long, stretched silence. Then Lucas stepped forward. No shackles, no guards flanking him. Just him. Just pews. Just Americans. And a God neither side had claimed as theirs alone. He sat at the back, didn't understand every word. But when the congregation sang, "I once was lost, but now am found," he mouthed it. Offbeat, off-key, but honest. Some Americans glanced at him. One old woman nodded. And that was it. No speeches, no conversions, no war, just a room where no flag flew, no salute was made, and no one checked rank. When he returned to the yard, Lucas's hands were still shaking, not from fear, but from memory. "There is a kind of mercy," he wrote, "that does not ask which side you fought on." And still, mercy was only the beginning. What came next would challenge even that. They thought it was luck. They were wrong. In the Atlantic, during U-boat raids, German crews would marvel and curse at how American cargo ships seemed to know when to change course, when to scatter, when to vanish into fog like ghosts wrapped in steel. "They sail blind," the U-boat commanders said, "but somehow they see." The truth came months later. Deep in Texas, a POW education lecture led by a retired naval technician. He rolled in a chalkboard, a metal dome, a diagram of waves bouncing through air. Radar. But not just any radar, on merchant ships. That's when jaws tightened, arms folded. Prisoners exchanged glances, not out of confusion, but betrayal. Private Joachim Ritter had served aboard a Kriegsmarine patrol boat in the Baltic. He had believed in German supremacy, at sea, at night, in fog. And now, in a dusty camp classroom, he realized he'd been blind all along. "We were throwing torpedoes into the dark," he said, while they were drawing maps of our silence. The POWs leaned in. They asked questions. Too many, too fast. The lecturer didn't flinch. He smiled. Then came the kicker. The technician reached into a crate and lifted out what looked like a metal salad bowl. This, he said, was on the SS Samuel Chase, a Liberty ship. It spotted your subs before you even surfaced. Gasps. One man cursed under his breath. Another laughed, a short, angry sound like a cracked bone. Joachim said nothing, but when the others left, he lingered, traced the rim of the radar dish with his fingertips, as if touching proof of a magic he wasn't supposed to believe in. They could see through fog, but we lived in it. The war, he realized, hadn't been fought in 2 dimensions. It had been layered in signals, frequencies, invisible threads of information, and the Allies had woven those threads into nets. But the deeper realization? The Americans had never bragged. They had simply let the data speak. And next, the Germans would hear what oil sounds like when it flows beneath the sea. They couldn't believe it. Oil from England to Normandy, through a pipe, not barrels, not tankers dodging U-boats, just a metal vein, pulsing fuel across the English Channel like blood through an artery. The Americans called it Pluto, pipeline under the ocean. To the German POWs, it sounded like science fiction. Until the documentary reel started. Inside the rec room, the lights dimmed. A calm, confident narrator explained, laid in secret, protected by deception, delivering thousands of gallons per hour. Private Hans Adler, once a pipeline technician for the Reich, leaned forward. The screen showed reels of underwater cable spooling from British ships, specialized joints, pressure regulators, fuel gushing through like lightning through a wire. He whispered, "We would have needed 3 months to do that. And they did it during invasion?" A guard nodded without looking. The numbers were obscene. By August 1944, Pluto was pumping over 1 million gallons a day, directly into tanks, jeeps, planes, everything that would roll toward Berlin. But the part that broke them wasn't the scale. It was the silence. "We never saw it coming," Hans later wrote, "because we never imagined they could build without telling the world. No fanfare, no parades, just execution, precision, secrecy wrapped in engineering. It wasn't just oil flowing through those pipes, it was momentum, and it ran one way only. The film ended. The lights came up. Hans didn't move. He sat with his cap in his hands, turning it slowly, like he could wring understanding from cloth. They didn't outfight us," he murmured. "They outbuilt us." And in that moment, he wasn't thinking about the war anymore. He was thinking about the future, about what a nation could do, when it didn't worship destruction, but just when they thought they understood American strength. They were about to face its strangest twist of all, its restraint. They didn't guard it. They destroyed it. At a captured American outpost in France, German scouts stumbled upon something their reports couldn't explain. Rows upon rows of metal drums. Tens of thousands of gallons of fuel. Untouched, unused, burning. They torched their own reserves. One officer reported in disbelief. Not because they had to, but because they didn't need them anymore. Word of it reached the POW camp within a week. At first, the German prisoners dismissed it as Allied theater. "Propaganda," they scoffed. "No army gives up fuel, not in this war, not ever." But then, the Red Cross brought aerial photos. Plumes of smoke stretching for miles, oil slicks igniting in ditches, columns of fire where storage depots once stood, American-built, American-supplied, now American-incinerated, Private Marcus Stein, who once served in logistics, stared at the images for hours. He couldn't look away. "We fought for barrels," he whispered. "We measured victory in liters, and they just let it burn." It wasn't waste. It was a statement that they could afford to walk away, that this war for them was no longer about what they had, but about what they refused to give up, including their humanity. Because in that same dispatch was another detail. No civilians had been left behind near the fire zones, no prisoners harmed. The Americans had waited, cleared the area, and only then lit the match. They destroyed fuel to save lives. Marcus later wrote, "We destroyed lives to gain fuel." It wasn't a comparison he wanted to make, but the numbers made it for him. One camp guard said softly, "Sometimes the most terrifying thing about power is when it doesn't get used." That night, in the barracks, no one sang. No one cursed, just silence, and in it the sound of something collapsing. Not a building, a belief. But the deepest collapse was yet to come. They were told it was just a demonstration. A local rancher had brought horses to the edge of the POW camp, part of a 4th of July celebration. Nothing military, just kids, flags, rodeo tricks, maybe a few cowboy hats for the photo. But then a boy, 10, maybe 11, pulled on the sleeve of the guard beside him and pointed through the fence. "Can he ride with me?" The guard hesitated, looked over at the rancher, looked at the prisoner, a tall, sunburnt man named Heinrich Keller, once a stable hand in Bavaria. Then, unbelievably, nodded. They opened the gate. No handcuffs, no orders shouted. Just a rope loosely tied to the saddle horn. More symbolic than real. Heinrich swung into the saddle with the ease of someone who'd been born to it. The boy behind him whooped. The crowd, a mix of townsfolk, guards, and even a few off-duty officers, cheered as they circled the ring. But the POWs watching from inside the fence didn't cheer. They didn't move. They just stared, as if watching something that broke the rules of the world they thought they understood. "They put a child on our enemy's back," whispered one, and smiled. When Heinrich dismounted, he didn't speak. He removed his cap, placed it over his heart. The boy gave him a stick of gum. And then the twist. As the event ended, another rancher approached the fence. He called out, not to a guard, but directly to the POWs. "Any of y'all know how to help with horses? I could use a hand." That night, 3 German prisoners signed up for weekend labor. Not because they had to, because they were asked. "They gave us the reins," Heinrich wrote later, "and in that moment, we didn't feel like prisoners. We felt like men again." But the most dangerous part of dignity is realizing how long you've lived without it. And the next thing they'd lose wasn't a war. It was certainty. They thought it was a joke. The invitation came through the camp chaplain. Handwritten, polite, absurd. A local family wanted to host 2 POWs for Sunday dinner, not as guards, not for labor, as guests. Private Emil Wagner, former artilleryman from the Western Front, stared at the paper like it might explode. "They want us in their home?" The guards didn't laugh. They explained, under new Red Cross guidelines, and with the permission of both sides, local families could request cultural exchange visits. But no one talked about culture that night. Only roast chicken, biscuits, green beans with butter and cracked pepper, and silence so soft it felt padded. The mother set the table. The father said, "Grace." The daughter, maybe 16, poured sweet tea into real glass cups, and Emil forgot how to breathe. They passed the potatoes like we hadn't shelled their coast. He later wrote, "They offered dessert as if we weren't wearing the wrong uniform." The father asked what farming was like in Bavaria. The daughter asked if snow really came in October. The mother didn't ask anything, she just kept filling his plate. When Emil reached for a second roll, he paused, instinctively waiting for permission. The father smiled. "Eat, son. You're at our table now." That line hit harder than any shrapnel. After the meal, they didn't talk politics. They didn't talk war. They watched the sun sink behind the wheat fields and listened to the radio hum something slow and southern. And just before they left, the mother pressed a paper bag into Emil's hands. Inside, leftovers, wrapped in cloth, still warm. "We weren't forgiven," Emil wrote, "but for 2 hours, we weren't condemned." And when he returned to camp, he didn't speak for the rest of the night. The other POWs didn't ask, because they saw it in his eyes. He had tasted something more dangerous than defeat. He had tasted belonging. But the next part, that's when things got harder. Because once you've known grace, it's impossible to return to hate. They were scheduled to leave in spring. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. Paperwork was processed. Trains were arranged. Ships stood ready. But something unexpected happened. No one packed. The first to hesitate was Corporal Rudi Mahler, a mechanic from Hamburg with a scar over his eye and no family left to claim him. He sat on the edge of his bunk, turning a folded paper in his hands. Not a letter. A request. Permission to remain in the United States under supervised agricultural labor. The guard blinked. "You want to stay?" Rudi nodded once. "There is no home left, only memory." Within a week, 5 more requests followed, then 12, then 37. Some had fallen in love, not with women, but with silence, with soft pillows, open sky, and the feel of bread that didn't come by ration card. One had found a dog, another had been offered a job, a third simply said, "I like the way the mornings sound here." The American officials didn't know what to do. These were not men escaping punishment. They were men escaping the past. At night, the POW camp no longer buzzed with rumors of repatriation. It whispered with questions. "Do you think they'd let me work the same farm next season? What if I learned better English? What if I just didn't get on the bus?" And then, the most haunting line of all, spoken by an officer softly while staring out past the barbed wire. "I fought for the fatherland, but I found peace in Texas. Some did go home, many didn't. But all of them, everyone, left something behind in that sunburnt corner of America. A journal, a worn Bible, a cowboy hat, artifacts of a strange, quiet conversion, not of faith, but of faithlessness into hope. And still, we hadn't reached the collapse. That part was personal. He stopped writing in German. For 3 years, Corporal Dietrich Eberhardt had filled his notebook with sharp, disciplined strokes. Records of routine, sketches of guards, careful reflections on rations, weather, and orders. A soldier's journal, measured, loyal, unbending, until the letter arrived. Not from home, from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Inside, a report, dry, clinical, names, numbers, camps, and then a line that cracked everything. Confirmed, Belsen, Dachau, Auschwitz, Civilians. He read it once, then again, then dropped the pages as if they were burning. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat at his bunk, knees drawn to chest, notebook open in his lap, blank, pen trembling in his hand. Then, slowly, in crooked English, "We were not the heroes." He wrote it again. And again, "We were not the heroes." The next day, he asked the guard for a Bible. Not because he believed, but because he wanted to read something not written by men. Other POWs noticed. He stopped joining the language group, stopped singing. During morning roll call, his voice cracked, reciting his number. When asked if he was sick, he said, "Just waking up." One night, a storm rolled in over the plains. The others hid from the wind. Dietrich walked into it. No coat, no hat, just that same notebook, clutched tight to his chest. "They taught us to fear weakness," he wrote, "but I think shame is stronger." The next morning, he tore out the first 83 pages, burned them, watched the ashes spiral upward like the smoke from cities he once thought were victories. What remained was a single line. "If truth makes me a traitor, then let me betray every lie I ever served." The camp grew quieter after that, because it's one thing to lose a war. It's another to lose your story. And worse still, to know it was never yours to begin with. But Dietrich wasn't alone. Others would follow, one by one, like leaves falling out of season. He was the loudest voice, the last holdout. Sergeant Otto Fry had once slapped a fellow prisoner for saying Roosevelt might not be a devil. He corrected grammar in Nazi slogans. He quoted Goebbels with pride. He believed. But belief, like paper, burns quietly at first. It started when the letters stopped. Back home, his wife had always written every month like clockwork, but then nothing. He asked the camp clerk to check. Weeks passed. Then came the envelope, thinner than usual. Inside only a photo. His house, flattened, rubble, a boot sticking out from beneath the timbers. No note, no caption, just silence in grayscale. The next day, Otto didn't eat, didn't speak, didn't rise when the anthem played on the camp's battered gramophone. Instead, he walked, slowly, to the corner of the yard where the children played. Not German children, Texan ones. A little girl, her hands sticky with jam, was showing a POW how to make a clover chain. She looked up at Otto, smiled, and without hesitation, offered him one. He took it. His hands shook. Later that afternoon, he approached the camp's makeshift classroom, asked, quietly, for an English primer. "You already speak English," the instructor said, surprised. Otto replied, "No, I only shouted it." From that day on, he stopped leading political debates. He started watching the sunset, started helping the cook, started fixing broken hinges, not because he was told to, but because they squeaked. One night, he stayed late in the library. The chaplain passed by, asked what he was reading. Otto didn't answer. He simply held up a copy of Leaves of a Grass. "What do you think?" the chaplain asked. Otto looked at the words, then at his own hands, then said, barely above a whisper, "I think I was never strong. I was just loud." That week, he trimmed his mustache. No one mentioned it. No one had to. Some conversions come with fire. Others come with quiet and clover. But the quiet was growing louder. He dreamed in color again. It startled him, because for years, every dream had been gray. Trenches, snow, smoke, always the same, running, shouting, silence. But this time, there were sunflowers. Private Leonhard Schultz woke up gasping, heart racing. In the dream, he was back in Würzburg, but not the real one, not the bombed-out shell. This one had no rubble, no checkpoints, only cobblestone streets and his mother's voice calling him in for supper. But when he reached the door, it wasn't Germany behind it. It was Texas. The field, the chapel, the mess hall with the broken radio, the boy who gave him a pencil, the girl who once offered him a peach and said, "For you, no reason." And that's when he wept, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of something no uniform had prepared him for. "I no longer know where I'm from," he wrote in his journal, "only where I felt safe." That morning, he didn't report to roll call. He asked to stay in the infirmary, not for illness, but because he couldn't face the anthem that played every Thursday, the German anthem. The nurse, a woman from Missouri with a face that reminded him of his aunt, sat beside him. "Tell me," she said gently, "what would you miss most if you left tomorrow?" He didn't answer, just looked at the window, where sunlight painted bars across the floor, like the softest prison in the world. That afternoon, he began writing a letter, not to his father, not to Berlin, to the librarian, to thank her for teaching him that belonging isn't about blood. It's about being asked if you want cream in your coffee. He never sent the letter, but he folded it carefully, placed it between pages 74 and 75 of To Kill a Mockingbird. He hoped someone would find it someday. "If I ever go home," he wrote, "I will miss the country that never asked me to kneel." That night, he had the dream again, but this time, he didn't open the door. He just stood in the sunflower field and watched the Texas wind move like forgiveness. But the story wasn't over yet, because sometimes the last chain isn't steel. It's silence. And one more voice still needed to break it. The train was ready. Not metaphorically, literally. Steam hissed. Men gathered. Bags packed. Names checked. It was repatriation day. For many, it meant going home. For some, it meant starting over. For one man, it meant letting go. Lieutenant Friedrich Baum stood alone at the far end of the barracks, staring at a box. Inside, a small wooden carving, a horse, whittled from Texas mesquite, sanded smooth by calloused hands. No one had ever seen him carve. No one even knew he could. But over 2 years, during storms, Sundays, and sleepless nights, he had shaped that figure. Not as art, as apology. He wrapped it in cloth, wrote nothing, then placed it on the desk of the camp commander just before roll call. No ceremony, no explanation, just a gift from a man who had once refused to say thank you. That morning, when his name was called, he didn't answer. He wasn't sick. He wasn't hiding. He was in the chapel, kneeling, not praying, just breathing. "Do you want to go home?" the chaplain asked. Friedrich replied, eyes still closed, "I already did." He boarded the train last, didn't look back, but the camp remembered. Because the commander kept the horse on his desk, because the guards stopped locking the library, because in the weeks that followed, letters came from Germany, not to families, but to the children of Texas who had once shared their ice cream. "You gave us your quiet," one letter read, "and in it, we heard our own noise and laid it down." And that was how the war ended for them, not with parades, not with flags, but with wood and silence, and a boy asking, why did he leave the horse behind? "Because," the commander said, "it was never his to keep. It belonged to the place that made him human again." The wheels screeched. Steam rose, but in the distance, Someone was still carving. The last sound was not the whistle. Not the grind of steel on rail, not even the wind that stirred the American flag as the train pulled away. It was a knock, soft, uncertain, on the office door of Camp Hearn's commander. When he opened it, he didn't find a guard, or a Red Cross clerk, or even a prisoner. It was a child, barefoot, freckled, holding something wrapped in paper. He left this, she said it was for anyone who still didn't understand. Inside the wrapping, a drawing. Crude, sketched in pencil, but unmistakable. A fence. On one side, a man in uniform. On the other, a boy with ice cream. Their hands touched through the wire, and below it, scrawled in block letters, no rank, no name, just 7 words. I didn't escape. I came home. The commander said nothing. He simply placed the drawing next to the wooden horse on his desk, then sat and stared. For a long time. Years passed. The camp became a museum. The bunks were emptied, the barbed wire replaced with placards. Visitors came and went, snapping photos, reading captions, nodding at history. But some paused longer. At the glass case near the chapel, inside, the horse, the drawing, a translation of the last diary entry ever recovered from the POW barracks. They taught us to fear. They taught us to fight. But no one taught us what to do when the enemy gave us his kindness. The visitors often grew quiet there. Some wiped their eyes. Others just stood still, listening. Not to audio guides, to silence, and to something else. The realization that perhaps the most radical act in war is not defiance, but decency. So now the question isn't what happened in Camp Hearn. It's whether you've ever heard a story like this before. And if you haven't, maybe it's because we never thought stories like this deserved to be told. Until now. Because sometimes the bravest soldiers are the ones who stop marching. If this changed how you see history, share it with someone who still remembers, or someone who never knew. And ask yourself, if your grandfather had been offered that bowl of ice cream, would he have taken it?